Hey guys, so we are going to be in Matthew 10 verses 21 through 42 tonight. And I know it's a little bit of a doozy, but give it a read and see what you get from it. And then after you've paused, come back and we'll talk about it a little bit. So up until this point, Jesus' followers have kind of been living, I guess you would say, the high life. You know, they have been following Jesus around. They've been seeing him work all of these miracles. They have seen him kind of at his best. I mean, people were loving Jesus. They're getting excited as he comes into town. Some people were just almost wanting to see Jesus as if they're coming out to see a show. They want to see him work some big miracle. But as excited as they were before this, I would say that a few of them left either confused or with their head hung low after hearing this part of Jesus' dialogue in Matthew 10, because it kind of takes for a darker tone, I guess you would say. Definitely wouldn't be drawing too many followers from this message alone. And so there's a lot that he talks about in these passages, but there's just maybe 5 points I wanted to hit on at different verses. And the first one is in verse 22, where he talks about how the disciples would be treated by others. And he basically says they're going to be hated by all, but then the one who stands firm to the end through this persecution will be saved. And so as Jesus is sending out his disciples, he's sending them with his authority. But as they share in his authority, he tells them they're also going to share in his persecution. But despite the persecution, Jesus' followers will persevere till the end. And in these true followers that persevere to the end, it's not their perseverance that saves them, but one of the byproducts of a saving faith is the perseverance. The person that's truly put their faith in Christ is not going to turn their back on him for any reason. So now skipping down to verses 29 to 31, it kind of talks about our value to God. And so Jesus, he's just spoken about the fear of God, and suddenly the tone kind of shifts from kind of a heavier nature to a much more lighter nature. And so it tells us that the same God who we're supposed to be in awe of and who we're supposed to be reverent of is also the same God who cares about even the smallest of his creations. It tells us this dove, or in Bible times the dove was literally just worth a penny or two. And so if God cares about this little insignificant, worthless bird, how much more does he care about his creation that he made in his image? It tells us that God knows his creation intimately. If he knows the insignificant things about us, like the number of hairs that are or maybe aren't on our head, then just think about how he knows all of the super significant details of our lives, our dreams, our greatest fears, every doubt that we've ever had. So if he knows all of these things about us, he'll sustain us through all of those things as well. Then skipping down to verses 32 through 33, it talks about us identifying ourselves with Christ. And so as believers, at the moment that we put our faith in Christ, we are proclaiming that we identify with him, that we are his and he is ours. And that's kind of what baptism is. It's an outward sign of an inward change within us. It's us publicly saying that we are following Christ and we're being obedient to him. And so in these verses, Jesus is noting that in times of persecution, his followers may have a chance to denounce him in order to end the persecution. However, his faithful followers know that this world is not their ultimate home, that this life is just a short blip on the span of eternity. And so just like we said just a minute ago, his true followers are going to persevere till the end. Despite the persecution, they are not going to denounce him, and Christ will not denounce them. Realistically, you and I are probably never going to face torture or death or criminal punishment for our faith. We're probably not going to face that kind of persecution. But how do you handle persecution from your friends? How do you handle the times when they're making fun of Christians, or maybe even they're making fun of you directly for your faith? Do you try to kind of back away from being identified with Christ? Do you try to minimize your relationship with him in order to fit in better with them? Or do you proudly and boldly stand on your faith in Christ? It can be a little hard sometimes when we just really want to fit in and and kind of ride the waves of the crowd, but Jesus says it's important for us to stand with him and tell everyone that we are his and he is ours. All right, skipping down to verses 34 through 36, talks about the divisive nature of Christ and that he must be our first priority. And so here Jesus tells him that us following him has to be our first priority. Our relationships with everyone else come second. Our spouse, our parents, our brothers and sisters, our best friends, any and every other human relationship has to come second to Jesus. He has to be our first priority. And some people may not understand that, and that may cause problems. And, even if we have to cut harmful relationships out of our life, relationships that are harmful to our faith, whether that be friends who are tempting us to do things we know are sinful, whether that be a romantic relationship that we know is not taking a God-pleasing turn. We sometimes have to cut those relationships out of our lives in order to prioritize Christ. A lot of times the world doesn't understand these things, but once again, Jesus says that his followers will put him first. Finally, skipping down to verses 38 through 39, Jesus talks about taking up our cross and following him. And to understand this, we have to understand why criminals took up their cross. And so a lot of times they were prisoners, criminals in Rome. They were beaten before their execution, but even after being beaten, they were still forced to carry their cross. And this was kind of a public display of a final act of submission to the Roman government, showing that the criminal is submitting to Rome and submitting to their punishment. They're carrying their own method of execution. And so Jesus is kind of using this metaphorically to say that by taking up our own cross, we are submitting to Christ, and we are submitting even to the persecution that we may face in his name. Because we know that any persecution or any trial that we face in this life is just a small speck compared to our eternal home in Christ. And so that's another question we ask ourselves. Is there anything in our lives that we have not submitted to Christ? Is there a temptation that we're holding on to? Is there some action that we know that we need to do that Christ is calling us to do, yet we don't want to do it for whatever reason? Is there anything that we have not submitted to Christ? Or are we all in? Are we all submitted to what he wants in our lives? I know it's a lot to chew on, but it's definitely some good stuff.